I'm going to start by wishing everyone a really warm welcome to our Charity Property Forum webinar today on formulating a stay versus go decision, hosted by CLUTTONS, Russell-Cooke and Nat West. My name is Chris Waite and I head up our charity sector at CLUTTONS. And if you're unfamiliar with CLUTTONS, we're a firm of property consultants covering the UK and specialising in charity property. I think everyone will agree it's been a tumultuous year, particularly for charities where demand pressures have broadly gone up and sources of funding have been constrained by the pandemic. However, light is shining through the tunnel and there's certainly more certainty around making decisions on your organisational future direction. Many of our charity clients are considering their property strategy, especially in regard to stay versus go, and the success of home working versus the cost of occupying offices has been put in sharp focus. This is naturally leading organisations to consider how change can deliver maximum benefit for your mission. And over the next hour, our experts will help frame some of those key foundations which will assist in your decision-making process. There'll be 3 short presentations from CLUTTONS, Russell-Cooke and Nat West to join the core property and legal considerations in reviewing your office accommodation strategy, along with a brief overview of the commercial mortgage landscape for charities. Finally, we'll wrap up with a panel discussion, and please do use the chat facility in the location bar to ask any questions. Without further ado, enough from me, I'm going to introduce our panel of presenters today and panelists. From the home team, we have John Gravitt, who heads up our real estate management at CLUTTONS. John specialises in acting for occupiers and investors, looking at how they can best utilise their commercial space. John will be kicking off the first presentation, covering the survey, our market presentation, or our market update rather, the process in formulating your stay versus go strategy. And also from the home team, we have Ralph Pearson, who some of you will no doubt know. Ralph is our resident charity specialist and he'll be joining us on the panel. Our next presentation will be covering legal, and it will be from Andrew Small and Claire Garbett. Andrew is a partner and Claire is an associate in Russell-Cooke's specialist charity and social business team, specialising in property law for charities. Last but no means least, we have Daniel Jacklin from Nat West, who will cover finance. Daniel is a relationship director working as a specialist charity banking team in London, managing portfolios for not-for-profit clients with a turnover from 10 to 300 million. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over John for our first presentation.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all who have joined this webinar. It's really pleasing to see you all here and supporting the event, and hopefully you'll walk away with some thoughts and views about next steps amongst what is a very difficult and complicated process. Pre-pandemic, let's remember that we were moving towards a more flexible working environment, but we hadn't tested working from home in a truly full manner, of which now the pandemic has enabled us to test that working from home environment. So we're in a bit more of a knowledgeable environment now in terms of the benefits of home working and the capabilities of home working. In the news, we see elements such as you see on the screen now in terms of some people, Goldman Sachs, for example, wanting a back to the office environment. And then we're hearing other sides of the view with home working, and then a hybrid in the middle, which is where at the moment most people seem to be sort of navigating themselves towards. But every operation, every business, every organisation will have its own requirements, and it's your own DNA that will drive the output of that. And I hope this call or this webinar takes you through some of those processes. So moving on to the next slide, please, Chris. So we conducted a survey, and thank you all to those who participated in that survey. Going through that, we can see the views of the group who are joining us today, and we can see firstly those that are thinking about change and what are the key drivers. And you can see there 3 key things came to mind. It's cost, it's requiring less space, and it's office fit for purpose. So pretty standard responses there, and a general similar approach from all people across the business, across the audience. Following that, we look at describe your current thoughts towards your future workspace requirements, and we have a resounding aspect that's about reducing the amount of space that you occupy. That's the key thing that really flowed through on that element. And then obviously we move then to the statements describing your thoughts. And I'll pick actually more aspect is it's unsure, and that is not a problem. That's normal. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market and drive towards new strategies. So we can see a third of the audience there still unsure about drive and what the change will mean. Right, Chris? We see the continued questions. So what workspace model will you aspiring to? And you can see a resounding output there in relation to the hybrid model. You can see there that the 97.5% really focusing on the hybrid aspects. Which of the following patterns do you feel could be introduced within your organisation without it damaging culture, communication, performance? And you can see there that it's that 60-40%. I think that's an opinion. It's personal rather than factual at the moment in time, is my estimation. And hopefully we can guide you through some of that thought process afterwards. But you can see there that good 50-55% of that sort of hybrid model and 60-40 split. And then finally, what is the preferred method of property ownership? We've got leasehold, we've got freehold, staying pretty static. The key aspect there is the people that are looking to sell freehold and move to lease property. So you can see that sentiment of a shift away there to create a more flexible environment with leased environment and releasing the freehold ownership. So thank you all those who participated. I think this helps frame some of the thoughts that we're all thinking when coming into this webinar. So Chris, move on to the next slide, please. So thinking about stay versus go, we've got drivers that we have to look about. Structural drivers. What does your lease say? What's your current property portfolio? What's the size, the location, the configuration? How are elements all put together? All these structural elements need to be analysed and reviewed. You then need to look at your DNA of your organisation, your charity. What is it and where are you going? And what is the economic backdrop for yourselves? Is there growth? Is there contraction? Is there cost reduction? Is it going to be expanding, growing? Do you need a different network? Do you need different regional locations, different audience? Is the stakeholders changed? And obviously going on to the opportunities to refresh brands, refresh your opportunity, and refresh your relationship with your stakeholders. And then finally, there's that element of talent and needing to retain the best talent and seek maybe new talent pools on the changes that have happened during and post-pandemic and how organisations shift. And having a review of your operational portfolio enables you to amend or view your opportunity to get to that talent and to make sure you retain and enhance your ability to attract that so essential talent pool. And one stat there on the side from the MSCI's survey shows that 75% of occupiers go at lease break. Everyone's requirement will be different. It's just giving you that sentiment there. There is that opportunity should a lease break arrive for yourselves to utilise. Going on to the next survey aspect, we look at the Leaseman survey. Leaseman have a database of circa 800,000 office workers, and during the pandemic they then diversified that to include about 160,000 home workers providing their surveys. What's so important here, it shows there that only 15% believe they want to go back to work 4 or 5 days in the office, and the key stat there is right in the middle, 48% are looking for the 2 to 3 days. Every job, every organisation will be different, so these are just surveys giving general sentiment, but it illustrates a direction of travel. Home working, you can see there that people love the home working, from access to information from the surveys, productivity, far more effective, one can say, individually focused, planned meetings, video conferences, being a bit more structured. The negative, obviously, is you can't collaborate as easily, feeling connected, the social aspects of interaction, the informal planned meetups, and sharing knowledge can at times be a bit more complicated. One thing though is about our office fit outs, and this moves to whatever we do with our offices, and if we retain an office network going forward, which is obviously most likely, is need to really focus on what is required. You can working as better or as suitable when offices, which is meant for work, not living, only scored 63 points. It illustrates that we need to up the game on the office fit out and the feel of the office to make sure you get the right outcome. And 76% do not have an outstanding office experience. If you're going to the office to work, that's its prime purpose. It should be positive. It should be even target the outstanding aspects. So we need to work as the property professionals to make sure we create the right office structure and office environment for our staff to make sure they get the right experience. So having a look at the marketplace in general, I know Ralph will be on the panel afterwards to take any questions in particular on this aspect, but we can see the opportunities there. You can see the rental market in the city going down 6%, 4.5% for the West End, and then 25 sort of donut looking at the 1%. So there provides opportunity. But then, of course, overlaying that is supply and demand, with take up down, supply up 28%, and vacancy rate as well at 9.5%. So you can see between the rental aspects and the supply, there is the opportunity to maximise savings and or better occupation or greater flexibility through these metrics. And I'm sure Ralph can take further questions on that during the Q&A. So there is an opportunity. We find ourselves coming through this pandemic and exiting the pandemic with an opportunity. We have to look at our lease provisions. We have to look at renegotiating of lease terms. There are opportunities there where landlords want to have the security of a tenant going forward. So therefore there is the ability to negotiate. Looking at rent savings and more importantly, incentives. Incentives is where the thought process should be more focused, more than just cold rent savings. Greater lease flexibility is really important, and right sizing. We need to ensure we've got the flexibility to move up and down as you flex in operations in a pandemic and post-pandemic environment of what the future marketplace will be like. And then obviously there is the debate of freehold versus leasehold. Great to have Daniel on the panel who can help us view that from actually a financial perspective, which is obviously so important. So how can we increase efficiency in your current office space? I think if we look at 4 key areas, wellness and environment, I would like to package together. It's really important that we look at those scores from Leaselands and we look at how we need to move our office environment going forward. We need to look at wellness, how we can make that a much more positive environment, how we do the fit out to make sure that we look at light, air quality, make sure we've got the right environments, collaboration space, breakout areas and the quality. And access to local amenities, either within the office or office environment or within local areas to make sure people have access to the right support and network they need, both socially and from a work perspective. These are all ingredients we need to build within our strategy of stay versus go to understand how we can get the right output for clients and for our stakeholders and our internal stakeholders being the staff. Connectivity is the backbone of an office environment. We all connect via many devices, multiple devices, and that's how we communicate with the cloud and the IT backup. So our connectivity is so important. It's also important because when staff have downtime in the office during lunch breaks, etc., they're obviously on their own personal devices. So it's needed for many different areas, not just pure rudimentary of the office productivity. And then obviously we need to add in the flexibility, which we knew was required beforehand, but is very much needed now as we go through an exit of the pandemic. So we got to look at the process now of stay versus go decisions. So I'd like to take you through the pyramid of decision-making process from the very top through to implementation. And if we can go on to that slide now. So we have to look at the property the charity's overall aspiration and goals. And then we need to link that to the property aspiration. How can we make sure that the charity's vision can be aligned with the property portfolio that is required? From that aspiration, you go through to purpose and aims. And again, you've got to realign and deliver that link to your property strategy, which then flows into the asset management policy. Asset management starts from a corporate, from a charity sort of trustee level, going down into the individual service lines and departments, be that HR, be that finance, be that operations, understanding how each service department will require property, how they'll utilize property, and how that may flex and change over time, which then flows into the asset management plan that will be a living and breathing document that takes you through the lifetime of the asset and will need to be revisited at periods of time. But that ultimate pyramid is how the principles of the asset management plan has to work and start shaping the decision making of a stay versus go policy. In terms of asset management considerations, there are many considerations to look at, and you can see the vast array, and these are just some, this is not all. You can look at the charity's overall objectives and strategy. We need to look at the corporate values, we need to look at the finance of the organisation and the outlook, the future vision, the operating model, the brand, stakeholder engagement. We need to look at all forms of policy in terms of government policy, charitable status, how that impacts. All these things could affect the asset management strategy. We then need to look at property management considerations. What's the visions of the property portfolio going forward? How does that link in with investment? It may then play into freehold versus leasehold, which leads into some of the actual value gain of the property portfolio. Procurement, sourcing of the FM providers, electricity, all other forms of procurement that fits into that. Sustainability and environment, and then the possibilities of co-location. Even more prevalent, I would say, potentially, as we exit the pandemic, where maybe certain charities will be looking to collaborate more closely and realign those benefits and savings. So one there that could be a really new avenue to really focus on and work in collaboration within the sector. But with all those touch points, there comes an awful lot of data. So far, a lot of this would come through and it gives people an opinion. But a charity, trustees, a board can't make decisions on opinions. They've got to make decisions on business cases and on fact to make sure they've got the right governance and the right process by which to make those decisions. And as you can see here from the statement here, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So in the CLUTTONS, for example, we do a lot of data mining and data work with our data management team to ensure that we amalgamate data from all different parts. We need to hear from HR, from finance, the property registers, FM, to make sure we amalgamate all that data together to understand how the asset management policy works, to understand the pull and push between different parts, so we can then try and design the outputs that is required. You can't move into a strategic thinking without having comfort and knowledge of where you are presently and where there are opportunities to gain. And this data management perspective is the backbone of how you move forward into that next phase. So really can't underestimate the importance of data management in any process of stay versus go. So our approach to stay versus go decision making is highlighted here on the slide. Data collection, as I highlighted, is so important. Starts obviously internally, staff numbers, space utilisation, HR costs, finance, home working locations, all these things now that need to be brought into the mix, including obviously the IT and technology capabilities. And you compare that to your current environment, the size, location, type, key lease dates, and what your current costs and your budgets and forecasts are looking like. You then move that into the strategic review side, staff satisfaction, make sure you engage with your workforce, contract terms, sustainability, contract requirements, your technology environment, where's your technology platform moving to? And I'm sure we've all tested the resilience of that over the last 12 to 14 months. And then you look at lease expiries, opportunities of underutilised space. How can you work for the collaboration fund, sublet? How can you move forward with those spaces, co-location, and how we can minimise costs. From that data bank and from all that gathering and exercise, you can then move on to the option analysis and then providing the business case, which when you move on to the next slide, there will be a lot of work behind all this, which provides the cash flow modelling and all the other business case requirements. But ultimately, it gives you a high-level benchmarking of what your options are. Gives you the options of your existing properties and the alternative options around that, giving you ability to make reasoned decisions of what the timeframes are, disruptions to your operations, and then the opportunities that could come out from it, linked to all the financial implications, soft and hard aspects between a move or stay policy. And even if it's a stay policy, there will no doubt be a lot of work to reinvigorate that workspace to make it work. As we go forward, as we've heard, the staff definitely want different requirements. We need to listen to that and embed that in any new strategy going forward, even if it's a stay policy. So moving on to the final sort of slide is the summary, stay versus go. If you're thinking of change, you need to understand the drivers as we've laid out and the vision of what you want to achieve. You'll need to engage consultants, and there'll be a vast array of consultants, no doubt, that will be required. But there'll be a process. It's not a big bang. There'll be a process of engagement of that supply as you go through that process. Think about the data collection. Think about how you're going to gather all your data from across different parts of the organisation, as I mentioned, to put that into a place to become together one source of truth, from which then you can move forward to the stage 4, which is the strategic review of what options you have available to yourself. From that strategic review, you'll be able to come to the decision-making process of stay versus go. And then finally, you go on to the implementation phase, which then can be obviously even more complex in terms of delivery of the actual outputs. We have provided another slide, and I know that Chris will be circulating the slide deck after this presentation, and I won't go through this slide in detail, but it does illustrate there are the positives and negatives of freehold and leasehold ownership. So it's one here that you can review afterwards when you get the slide deck, but it's one that it should be noted in terms of the charity sector, in terms of availability of what is going to be right for the status going forward, what the opportunities are, more importantly, in either direction, and obviously again linked with the financial aspects that hopefully Daniel can touch on as well. So I hope that gives you a quick view of the opportunities of stay versus go, and obviously I'll happily move on now to my colleague Andrew, who's joining to talk from the legal side. So thank you, Andrew, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning, everybody. So just moving on to the first of our slides, just to say what Claire and I are going to talk about over the next few minutes. I'm going to talk about this process from a sort of high-level charity law point of view, thinking about how the sorts of processes John has talked about fits into charity governance and the importance of trustees making sure that the process is being done properly so they can show that they're complying with their duties. Going to talk, give a couple of examples of where it can all get, of where it can all go a bit wrong. Talk about the process that needs to be followed. Some of the sort of relevant hard charity law that comes up with property transactions such as this. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and then Claire's going to focus on some sort of the more sort of drill down into some of the detail of some of the practical issues that come up in terms of assessing, what the legal constraints may or may not be in formulating a stay versus go decision and then implementing it. So, Chris, if you can move forward to, I think if you can move forward to the next slide, I think I've already done that. Perfect, thank you. So as John was saying, the first phase of this process is a sort of data gathering exercise, because if you're going to decide, whether to stay versus go, it's important that you know where you're starting from. And I think this is important from a legal point of view, as well as a how you use an occupied space point of view. And even if as a charity you're not currently sort of considering a stay versus go or a major property transaction, it's really important that you've got a handle on your property portfolio and understand what you own and how you're using it, and that you're using it lawfully and correctly. And charities have been criticised by the Charity Commission for not having a grip on this issue. And there's a good example of how the Charity Commission views this issue. The charity Christ Embassy, which was the subject to a regulatory inquiry by the Commission that was published in November 2019. And one of the many things that the trustees of that charity were criticised for were that they didn't have a handle on their property portfolio, what properties they owned, and how they were using them. And there's some quite useful guidance as certainly how the Commission sees this issue. And they would say that trustees really need to know what properties they own. They need to know that the title is correctly recorded to show it's being held by a charity, that it's being lawfully used. It's being lawfully used and properly maintained, and also that it's properly insured. So these are, so it's really important for starting out on this process that you know where you're starting from a legal point of view, and that your portfolio is, well managed, maintained, and understood by the trustees. So on to the next slide. Again, just another example of what can go wrong with a major property transaction, and if you don't approach it in the right way from the right starting point. And this is a good example of where the advisory team, frankly, wasn't, from everything one's seen about this job and everything one's read about this matter, the advisory team, both surveyors and solicitors, didn't understand the regulatory and legal environment they were working in. So this was the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain. They had a central London property that they sold for £6 million. Great, major capital received for the charity. Looks fabulous. A few months later, the buyer flipped it flipped it on for £21 million. So it looked like, you know, the trustees left a huge amount of money on the table there, and the upshot was the really practical one of a real derailing of the charity, because for the next 4 years they were doing very little but you know, fending off a very difficult Charity Commission regulatory inquiry, which ended up with an inquiry report that was very, you know, that was critical of the trustees in a lot of aspects. And it was really, you know, the Commission concluded, I think rightly, that the trustees were in breach of their legal duties in respect of how they had gone about this major property transaction. So it's really important that you get off on the right foot, understand the legal constraints that you're operating under, and that you've got a professional team that also understands that. So thanks, Chris. So on to the next slide. Again, process is important. I mean, as John illustrated, there's going to be an awful lot to do and an awful lot to think about, and just having property relocation as a standing item at each quarterly board meeting, you know, that's not going to be the right forum to deal with it. There's not going to be enough time and capacity within the rhythms of normal board meetings to to implement the sort of process that John was talking about. So it's really important, I think, you know, to think at an early stage of setting up a subcommittee, probably a mixture of trustees and executives, to carry out the initial analysis, you know, the initial options appraisal, and then move, if you decide to go, into the implementation phase. So it's important again that that subcommittee is set up with clear terms of, you know, with clear terms of reference, that the composition of it is right, and that there's also a process in place for the subcommittee to report back to the main board at appropriate intervals in the process. But main board itself is very unlikely to be the right forum to implement, to drive this process forward. And again, as John alluded to, the interaction with consultants is going to be sort of potentially many and varied, but it's really important to try and get the core team together early so that the subcommittee knows it's getting proper advice and is sort of setting off on this process on the right foot. Moving on to the next slide. It's important to note there is some relevant hard charity law that's going to come up in in this process. If you're disposing of, if you're disposing of an existing property, whether that's freehold or leasehold, and if it's leasehold, you could be subletting, you could be surrendering. That's a disposal of charity land that's going to trigger the requirements of sections 117 to 121 of the Charities Act. And in order to properly comply with that, you will need advice from a qualified surveyor that the disposal is on the best terms that can reasonably be obtained. That's the end point. But again, there's quite a lot of process and detail that the surveyor will need to go through to get that conclusion. And worth mentioning, though, that the Law Commission recommendations to reform sections 117 to 121 may finally be being implemented, because 4 years after the Law Commission report, the government has responded, and there's an increasing amount of chatter that we may get a new charities bill either later this year or next year. So again, just then I'm moving on to the last of my slides, which is some of what Daniel will talk about, is if you're getting loan or grant secured funding to fund an acquisition, and that could be loan funding from a bank or grant funding, say, from one of the lottery providers. In respect of that legal charge, you will need to comply with the requirements of sections 124 to 126 of the Act, which involves the trustees taking professional advice on whether the loan or grant is necessary, whether the terms are reasonable, and whether it can be repaid if necessary. So that's just an introduction from me from some of the sort of higher level issues on the legal side of this. Claire's now going to drill down into some of the detail and specific issues that you may need to think about.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. So yes, I thought I'd start with one of the most likely scenarios, which is that you're a charity who has a lease and wants to leave the leasehold premises, and then pan on to some things that are more generally relevant for all disposals and other scenarios that we've touched on. The question is, if you've got a lease, how do you get out of it? John alluded earlier to break clauses, and if you're lucky enough to have a break clause which is still exercisable, i.e. you've got enough time to serve the notice before the break date that it needs to be effective by, then break clauses are by far the easiest way to get out of your lease. So the things to bear in mind with break clauses are that you need to make sure you've complied very specifically with the detail in the lease about your break clause. So there'll be very specific requirements for the form of break notice, how it should be served, who on, etc. And it's very worthwhile getting a solicitor to serve it for you to make sure that you have complied with all of the strict terms of the lease, because if you don't, then your landlord can argue that it's invalid and you've then lost your entire right to break. Similarly, in the lease there may be conditions attached to the break right which say that by the break date certain things need to have happened. So if you two conditions to specifically bear in mind, which hopefully your lawyer will have negotiated out of at the start and won't be in the lease. But if they are there, if you've got a condition to give vacant possession on the break date, then tenants have been caught out by that in the past if they left some workmen in the property to carry out repairs rather unfairly, or if they left internal partitioning in the property. Likewise, if there's a condition to pay all sums due up to the break date, bear in mind that that could include interest on sums that you didn't pay much earlier in the lease, or it might include insurance, rent, service charge, etc. So if you're unlucky enough to have that condition, then you need to make sure you've paid absolutely everything up to date and maybe ask the landlord for confirmation about what you might owe. The useful thing about break clauses is that they don't count as a disposal for the purposes of the Charities Act, as Andrew was discussing just now. So you don't have to go through the hassle of getting a surveyor's report, etc. However, if you don't have a break clause, some other options that you might have under your lease are to assign the lease, so to transfer it to another tenant. Obviously, this is a lot more hassle than a break clause because you actually have to find another tenant and make sure that you're confident that they're good for the lease covenants, so that you can hand over to them. One of the things that the landlord may ask for as a condition of assignment is an authorised guarantee agreement. And this is basically saying that you, as the outgoing tenant, will guarantee the obligations of the new incoming tenant, and also take a lease. If they fall out of the picture, then you might be obliged to take a lease for the remainder of the term when they've disappeared. So if you do end up being forced to enter into an authorised guarantee agreement, then effectively you haven't really divested yourself of all your liabilities, and you might end up having to use charity funds to subsidise a non-charity by guaranteeing their obligations. If you have to sign up to an ARGO and you can't get out of it, then it's worth minuting the fact that you considered how strong the incoming tenant was and how able they were to comply with the covenants, that you considered any other options, for example, a break right, and that you've carefully weighed up the risk that you stay on the hook and have to come back into the lease as against the benefit, the clear benefit now of getting rid of your current liabilities with respect to it. Also, an assignment will be a disposal for the purposes of the Charities Act, so you'll have to go through that procedure. And it's worth looking at the terms of the lease in the round, because there may be various things in the lease which would put someone off taking the property on from you, or prevent them from doing so. For example, you might have, if you've got a local authority lease, they might have specifically limited the use to you specifically, or they might just have a particular very narrow permitted use requirement, which is going to limit the market of people who would want to take the lease from you. And then another option is to surrender the lease back to the landlord, bringing it to an end. That's something that is entirely in the landlord's gift whether to accept or not, and they might try to extract a payment from you in exchange for agreeing to a surrender of the lease. It's also something where the Charities Act provisions will again apply, which can be really frustrating when all you're doing is getting rid of a liability, but that's also something to bear in mind. Okay, next slide, please. So then I just thought I'd briefly talk about the decision perhaps to stay and alter your existing property or to sublet it. If you're subletting, again, that's a disposal for the purposes of the Charities Act, so you'll have to ensure that it's on the best terms reasonably obtainable. If you're, and in either case, if you're altering, well, if you're subletting, then you need to make sure that the person who's coming in will be able to use the property for what they want. So you'll have to check both the planning position and the position under your own lease as to whether what they want to do is allowed. Also, more generally, you need to check the terms of the lease to see whether you require landlord's consent to either altering or subletting the property. And if you are altering, then you need to think about any planning permissions you might need, any statutory requirements, for example, with respect to asbestos or disability legislation or getting an energy performance certificate, etc. Next slide, please. And then I just thought I'd talk about the more general points if you were, for example, selling a property, and it's also relevant if you're trying to get rid of a lease to someone else to an extent. So the point that Andrew made really about knowing what you're dealing with early is the main one. I've put on the slide some of the many things that your lawyer would be looking for as part of disposing of the property. But I suppose there are two things to think about. First is, can you dispose of the property? For example, is there a restriction on your title in favour of a funder which requires you to get their consent and maybe pay them some money before you can dispose of the property? Or are there restrictive covenants which prevent various buyers using the property as they'd like to? Anything at a planning level that requires personal occupation by you. All of these things are things that can potentially be sorted, but they're worth considering and dealing with. And then the other side of the question is making the property as attractive to the buyer as possible by having sorted out as many problems in advance as you can. Sometimes it's worth actually getting the suite of searches that a buyer would do when taking the property from you in advance so that you can see any problems and deal with them early. There might also be people in occupation who you need to deal with, rights across the land, basically just dealing with those things early and making sure that your property is as clean for a buyer as possible can be very useful. And then final of my slides, next slide please. Yes, so on acquisition, if you're thinking of taking advantage of those low rents that John was talking about earlier, the same considerations apply, but in reverse. You want to be sure that you can do what you want to do from the property, that there's nothing too problematic in the property shown either by the results of searches or the results of inquiries. And you want to make sure that any lease that you're going to be entering into is going to be on terms which don't expose you to unnecessary financial risk or restrict what you're able to do from the property. That's it from me, and I'll now hand over to Daniel on the mortgage side.
Thank you very much, Claire, much appreciated. So as a brief introduction to me, what I'm going to cover off today, I am a relationship director at NatWest Bank. I specialise in the banking of charities and supporting them with funding, as well as a kind of full range of other banking services. Today I'm going to cover off the key considerations we look at when we're providing funding to a charity. Although we're talking, say, specifically about property, that actually covers off any kind of funding that we provide to them. As you saw on the previous slide, Chris has got slightly ahead of me. We bank about a third of all the charities in the UK. I work in a specialist charity team within central London, of which there's about 10 of us, and we do nothing other than banking for charities and not-for-profit organisations. Turnover from about 10 to 300 million, but we also deal with customers above and below that in different teams. Coming on to the key financing considerations, number one for us every single time is the ability to repay debt. We will not lend if we're not comfortable that a client can afford to repay it, be they a charity or a trading business. So we look at the reliability of that customer to be able to service that debt on both a historic and on a look forward basis. So for us, cash is king still remains true, very much so. So we look at the sources of income that a charity has. So ideally you have a diverse range of income. That will very much depend on the type of charity that you are. There are obviously lots of different business models, so it could be income from shops, local authority funding, grants, donations, membership fees, events like the London Marathon. And ideally there are a range of sources of income that you have, but we appreciate that not every charity will have that due to their nature. The other aspect that we then look at is the reliability of that income, and can it, be relatively accurately predicted, and therefore your ability to generate cash and therefore to service any debt with the bank. We do look at the past as a predictor of the future. So historically, how reliable has your income been? How diverse is that income? But we are not blind to the last year and the impact of COVID upon charities in particular. So things like London Marathon not running, things like events not being able to run as they normally would, charity shops being closed, will all have an impact on your income stream, and we don't ignore that when looking at a funding request. We then, the other pieces there within the ability to repay, we look at effectively your financial information, and we look at your ability to generate financial information, use that within the charity to run it, and to actually monitor how well you are doing with surpluses, with your expenses, and to manage that closely. We then look at the differences between surplus and cash. So for us, cash is what services the debt. So we always look at the cash that you generate as being key. We then look at the management team. So we just check that there's a appropriate breadth and depth for that charity. Depends on the size, depends on what you do. But we look at whether there are kind of key person risks within there, whether you have those main roles either covered or whether you outsource them and get quality input from HR advice, finance advice, for example. We also look at trustees, whether they have breadth and depth, and critically, do they challenge management? I think in historic charity failures, trustees' inability or unwillingness to challenge management has been an issue. We then look at security as a mitigant. So one key thing for me that I always explain to people is that just because we may be fully secured on a lend that we're providing somebody doesn't mean that actually we will do that lend. The ability to repay debt remains key. Having a nice big central London property as security is a mitigant, not a rationale. So we'll, whenever we're providing lending on a property, we will ask companies such as CLUTTONS to undertake valuations for us to make sure in an open market that we look like we would be fully secured. And we take legal charges, so people such as Russell-Cooke will take a charge over property for us. As I say, that's a mitigant, not a rationale. But we do look to have that second source of repayment if for whatever reason your ability to repay debt is impacted in the future. Moving on to the next slide, because I'm conscious of time, we wanted to get some questions and answers in there as well. There are a few conditions in any kind of lending provision from a bank, not just NatWest, that are, I suppose, important to consider when you're looking at funding. So first one is typically kind of loan to value. We would at most go to about 70% loan to value. So there needs to be a fairly sizable contribution in there from the charity when purchasing a property. In terms of the length of the debt, we would go as far as about 20-25 years. That tends to be exceptional. Within my charity clients, we tend to see about 15 years being around average. Key rule of thumb for me with any funding request is that the length of debt matches the life of the asset that you're funding. So with a freehold property, you could go 20-25 years because that asset will retain its value and hopefully grow in value. But with IT equipment, for example, which we're funding a lot of as people move to hybrid models, you wouldn't go more than 3 or 4 years because at that point your IT has been kind of superseded. Then last but not least, on larger loans, you would typically see what's called covenants in there. They're extra events of default that are added onto the loan, normally around things like serviceability. So are you generating, again, sufficient cash to repay the loan? And if not, then that would trigger an event of default. They allow basically the bank to renegotiate and restructure the loan. We never want to become owners of properties. Sadly, in some cases we are, but it allows us to work with the customer to get to an acceptable solution where we can restructure things. Like I say, conscious of time, so I'll dip through that one quickly. You'll have all seen the little disclaimers there and read those very well. And without further ado, I shall pass it back to Chris to cover off Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all of our presenters, John, Claire, Andrew, and Daniel, and welcome to the panel. So we also have Ralph now, and I thought now was a good time to just reflect on some of the presentations and pick up a few of the key themes that we've heard. And as Ralph is new to the panel, I'm going to go for Ralph first and ask him his first question. So because of the pandemic has forced home working for the last year, and it's largely been considered successful. Do you know, now we're sort of, there seems to be a buzz around flexibility, and everyone's looking to go more flexible, more agile, taking less space. Do you see a retrenchment back to the office in, say, a year or two's time, where, you know, the sort of buzz of agile working maybe slightly subsides, Ralph?
Yeah, I would say that perversely, the latest lockdown has changed a few people's minds. I mean, we were so good at working from home in the initial lockdown, to many people's amazement, and so many clients at that stage were saying we don't need an office anymore. But I do think, you know, the social collaborative side of things has changed people's thinking, and the staff surveys have turned about, and pretty much all of our clients are now saying that they do recognise the need for an office, but probably a smaller office. And if you've got a lease, the need for flexibility. So I do think there will be a fundamental shift in demand for offices. Best-in-class offices are holding up quite well, but there is going to be a wall of mid-grade space, I think, coming through, and that's going to impact on pricing. It does mean if you're a tenant that's not necessarily a bad thing. Rents will fall, rent-free periods are longer, and you will get more flexibility in negotiating a lease.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that before I go to the next question? And feel free to ask on the Q&A function. So sorry, I forgot to mention that. So do use the Q&A function. Ralph, sticking with you, workplace consultants. When would you advise using a workplace consultant in a stay versus go decision?
I'd say pretty much all of the clients who've taken on a workplace consultant have found they've got good value for money in terms of right-sizing the workspace, having regard to changing working practices. It also takes the sort of personal side out of it for the senior management team. Some people are very resistant to change, but workplace consultants are very good at taking people with them and depersonalising the need for change. You know, lots of liaison. I'd say a positive experience in virtually all cases, and I would recommend it. Even if you're not moving, if you haven't looked at how you use the space for some time, you know, you might find that you can free up some surplus space or use it better.
Okay.
I'll just coming in on that point, Chris. I'd say it's even more important in where we are now, because there is this different driver of people and what they want to achieve in that space. So everyone's unsure, so having support from workplace consultants is even more important in this more uncharted period than before, which also then links to the significant cost you incur when designing your space for what is for a long period of time, which then goes back to the responsibility of the trustees. So it sort of all does interlink back, and I think the value of the workspace consultant does provide comfort at several levels.
Thanks, John. I've got a few questions are rolling in the chat function. So, if you are selling a property, what are the panel's thoughts on timing? Will the market pick up or become saturated? Ralph, that's probably, yeah.
Shall I have a go at that? Although rents are falling, we are seeing capital values hold up reasonably well. We have sold a few buildings in the course of the last few months, and they've generally been at prices that we would have got pre-COVID. In some cases, they have been converted to residential, which is probably not a like-for-like comparison. I do think if you're going to sell, set a sensible target. If you don't get that target, then defer. But generally, values are holding. The other thing I would say is that offices are now, they were B1 use class, they're now part of Class E, which is a wider commercial class that includes food and beverage, retail, medical. So if you're selling a property, by definition, it will have some ground and lower ground floor space, and you might find that that's gone up in value on the back of the change in the use classes order. So it's certainly worth looking into that aspect.
Thank you, Ralph. And sort of neatly following on, really, as a charity, is it better to purchase a freehold or leasehold property? Is it better to purchase in Zone 1?
Is that me again?
I think
that's everybody. It's the challenge of freehold versus leasehold.
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of the $1 million question, isn't it? I think it's very much case by case as to whether you see a long-term requirement to be in that one location, or whether you're almost location agnostic. And if so, then freehold does have upsides to it. You know, you're buying an asset that hopefully increases in value over time, and building equity up rather than paying rent for the sake of flexibility, which you may not need or want. So I think it is down to whether you are relatively location agnostic, and actually whether that freehold itself will work for you in the long term and has flexibility to it, either be that increasing desk space, reducing desk space, subletting, as many charities are looking to do at the moment. So I think it's a difficult one to answer without knowing totally case by case, because I think if there was a definite way to do it, then everyone would be.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of comments to that as well, is that I think Daniel will bear me out that if you've got some cash and you can afford to put up your, whatever it is, 30% to meet the loan to value requirement, then it will be cheaper to service a loan than to pay rent on a like-for-like basis.
Generally speaking,
quite a lot. You know, there's quite a big margin there in truth. And the other point is that leases are restrictive, as Claire said, and if you own a building, you can do what you want with it within reason, whereas leases are hugely restrictive, even now, and there's going to be all sorts of disputes with landlords about what constitutes a market rent on a subletting. So there's a lot to be said for being a freeholder rather than a leaseholder.
But you are liable for the building, aren't you, Ralph? You know, if sort of your changes in headcount go up or they go down, then you are sort of having to look at subletting, which, you know, it sort of becomes potentially a liability. So please refer back to the slide that everyone will receive, which weighs up the sort of positives and negatives. Just one more quick question for Daniel on that is you know, this is crystal ball stuff, but what do you think is going to happen to interest rates? Because that sort of impacts.
If I knew that, I would be I would be in a different office and in an awful lot more money. I don't think they will move especially quickly in the short term. I think some of the impacts of Brexit are still to be felt, and I think that will still take a while to wash through. And I think if you look at international trade and how that may be affected post-COVID, I think with those two factors together, I think really difficult to predict, but I can't see them moving anytime soon in any significant way. If I look at the kind of quotes we're providing to our customers for providing a fixed interest rate at the moment, you know, to fix an interest rate for a year is at a very low rate, relatively speaking. Not that I'm making any recommendations in any way, shape or form. But yeah, it's not looking to move far anytime soon.
Thanks, Daniel. We have a question from Pat. Hello. Our office lease is in SW1, expires in Jan 2022. What date would you advise that we start looking for new offices? And what date should we have found an office? We don't want to leave it to too late in the year to start things. Ralph?
You need to start looking now, ideally, especially if the lease is contracted out. If it's a contracted out lease, you've got no rights of renewal, and if you run out of time, the landlord can basically ask you for whatever terms he or she wants to stay over. I do think you need to be looking now. You probably, if you're looking leasehold, it does usually takes a month or two to sort out a lease. They are complicated documents. I'm sure Andrew will chip in on that afterwards, and depends how much fit out you've got. Ideally, you should have found the property at least 3 or 4 months before your lease expiry date, but ideally more than that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, just to come, thanks Ralph, just to come in and tend to agree, and just to give one illustration, and Ralph will know one of the examples I'm thinking about at the moment, the sorts of things that can delay an office move and an office fit out is telecoms, because you can have everything else sorted out, all the legals done and what have you, but if BT Openreach haven't turned up to put the cable in, or the wayleave agreement isn't sorted out between landlord and tenant, you can have a lovely new office, but not able to, but not be able to use it. So that's just one of the, just to give one example of the sorts of reasons why Ralph is, is saying that the time scale for an office move is always a bit longer than you think. And, just to endorse advice, I think that, the time to start looking is now, probably on that sort of timeline.
Good. We've got a question from Graham Tour. Some charities own investment property and are considering what they can do to enhance the attractiveness / marketability of these properties, especially if tenants are coming to an end of their lease period. What are the main considerations, e.g. in the case of the building used for office purposes?
Well, it's probably one for me, isn't it? I think you need to look at it case by case. As I've said before, if it's the new Class E does create other opportunities. Oh, well, sorry, rewind. The big debate, if you own an office, is it more valuable for residential? Can you get planning consent? So everybody should be looking at that. Most of the central London boroughs tend to oppose the change, but there are permitted development rights. But then again, this new use class E means that you could look at all sorts of uses on the lower floors in the building that you couldn't have before, that you don't now need planning for. But you would need to look at each building on a case-by-case basis.
Just adding on to that as well, Chris, is, from what Ralph said, absolutely, but it's also the data points. And even though obviously then you're obviously using that as an investment portfolio, it's trying to look at what your local market has, how that is changing, and what the local demands are as well. So it's really important to try and get those information and data points to help rationalise and come to those sort of fruitful decisions.
Thanks, John. What are your...
I've spotted a couple that I could help with on the chat. So with the Susan's asked about ARGAs and Charity Commission guidance suggesting that charities shouldn't guarantee the obligations of non-charities. Yes, ideally you shouldn't, and normally we try and say to your landlord, look, sorry, we're not able to give an ARGA, we can't help there. But if they are insistent and it's the only way to get out of your lease, then if you've documented the fact that you've thought about all of these issues, then I think on balance you can enter into an ARGA as a way of getting out of the lease. And also someone's asked about section 35 of the Charities Act, just to confirm that is now section 117 to 121. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. We're pretty much on the hour mark. Time flies. So thank you very much, firstly, to all of our presenters and the panel. Really appreciate your time in putting together the slides. Thank you for everyone that's listening on the call. I think in summary, this really is an important decision that could really affect the success or failure of any organisation. It's a very important one that you get right. So as I said, really hope you found the session useful. There has been quite a few questions. We're happy to go back to those and answer those fully. And also, if you would like to ask any of the panel, there will be a summary email that comes around with the recording and the slides. And if you would like to ask any questions from our panel, you will have the contact details as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful.